The radio went dead on a Tuesday. Not static, dead. That flat, pressurized silence that tells you the thing on the other end isn't broken. It's gone. I was standing in the kitchen of the research station, holding a coffee mug I'd been nursing for an hour, when Lena walked in and set the handheld on the counter without a word. She didn't have to explain. I'd watched her try every frequency for the past 40 minutes, through the window above the sink, pacing the dock with the antenna raised like some kind of dowsing rod, turning slow circles against the gray morning sky. She'd started with the mainland Coast Guard channel, then the university's emergency band, then open frequencies, one after another, calling out our station ID into nothing. "It's not atmospheric," she said. "Everything's transmitting fine on our end." So nobody's answering. Nobody's there to answer. 3 days. That's how long it had been since the first reports. We'd caught fragments on the satellite feed before that cut out too. Shaky news footage from cities I'd never been to. Emergency broadcasts in languages I didn't speak. And then the ones I did speak, which were worse. The word they kept using was outbreak. But that's a medical word, a clean word. And nothing in those broadcasts was clean. The footage from Seoul showed people moving wrong. Not running, not stumbling. Moving with a kind of mechanical insistence, like bodies being operated by something that didn't understand how joints were supposed to bend. One clip from a hospital corridor in Frankfurt played on a loop for 6 hours before the feed dropped. I watched it twice. That was enough. Our island sits 11 miles off the northern coast of Vancouver Island, a crooked finger of rock and old-growth forest that the University of British Columbia uses as a marine biology field station. On a map, it barely registers. Most days, that remoteness felt like an inconvenience. The supply boat came once a week. The satellite internet was unreliable. And if you forgot to order something, you waited 7 days or learned to live without it. Now that distance felt like the only thing keeping us alive. There were 6 of us. Lena Murad, the station director, a marine ecologist in her late 40s, who'd spent more consecutive months on this island than anyone in the program's history. She had a way of compressing panic into efficiency that I found either reassuring or unnerving, depending on the hour. Dr. Caleb Oren, our fisheries biologist, who'd been 2 weeks from rotating back to the mainland when the news broke. He was 53, methodical, and had already started inventorying our food stores without being asked. Then there was Jin Seo Park, a master's student from Seoul, who'd been on the island for 4 months studying intertidal biodiversity. She was 24, fast-thinking, and the first person among us to say out loud what the rest of us were still circling around. "They're not sick," she'd said on the first night, sitting cross-legged on the common room floor with her laptop open to a cached news page. Sick people don't do that to other people, not like that. The other 3 were Marcus Webb, our maintenance technician, who knew every pipe, wire, and structural weakness on the island. His partner, Dana Kessler, a visiting ornithologist who'd come for a 2-week survey and was now stranded with the rest of us. And me, Elliot Voss, PhD candidate, 2nd year studying subtidal kelp ecosystems, 31 years old, the most useless skill set imaginable for the end of the world. On the morning the radio died, day 3, we gathered in the common room. Lena stood at the front near the whiteboard where she normally scheduled dive rotations and boat maintenance. She'd erased it all and written 2 words at the top in red marker: current situation. "We have provisions for approximately 5 weeks at current consumption," Caleb said, reading from a yellow legal pad. "That includes the dry stores, the freezer inventory assuming power holds, and the canned surplus from last season that never got shipped back." What about the generators? Marcus asked. Diesel for maybe 6 weeks if we cut non-essential power usage. That means no hot water past what the wood stove can manage, minimal lighting after dark, and the lab equipment stays off. Lena let the numbers settle before she spoke. We need to talk about what we're not talking about. The room went still. Through the window behind her, I could see the ocean, flat and gray, stretching toward a mainland we could no longer reach. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the world was eating itself, and we were sitting in a research station designed to study starfish, pretending that a 5-week food supply constituted a plan. Nobody's coming for us, Lena said. Not soon, maybe not at all. So we need to decide what kind of situation we think this is. The first argument happened that afternoon. It started with the boats. We had two, a 24-foot aluminum research vessel with a reliable outboard, and a smaller inflatable Zodiac used for nearshore surveys. Marcus had already checked both that morning. Fuel was limited but sufficient for several round trips to the mainland if needed. The question was whether anyone should make that trip. Caleb wanted to go. Not immediately, not recklessly, but soon. His reasoning was practical. We had no information, no communication, and a finite supply window. 5 weeks sounds like a lot until you're in week 4 with nothing lined up, he said. If we wait until we're desperate, we've already lost. Lena shut it down. We don't know what's on the mainland. We don't know if the ports are intact, if there's fuel, if there are people. We'd be burning resources on a scouting mission with zero intelligence. That's exactly why we need intelligence. And if whoever goes doesn't come back, then we're down people and down a boat. The argument didn't resolve. It folded into silence the way most disagreements did in those first days. Not settled, just deferred. People returned to tasks. Dana went to check the rainwater collection barrels. Jin Co. began cataloging the medical supplies, which were designed for field injuries, not long-term survival. Bandages, antiseptic, a modest supply of broad-spectrum antibiotics, ibuprofen, 1 EpiPen. Marcus walked the perimeter of the station compound, testing door locks and window latches with a kind of ritualistic focus that made me think he was less interested in security than in having something to do with his hands. I found myself on the south-facing bluff that evening, watching the water. The mainland was invisible from here. Too far, too much curvature, too much mist. But I stared at the horizon like I might see something. A signal, a ship, smoke. Anything that would tell me the world was still functioning on the other side of that gray line. Jin Seo appeared beside me without warning. She moved quietly, a habit I'd noticed in the weeks before the outbreak, when she'd appear in the lab doorway, already mid-thought, as if she'd been having a conversation with you in her head and was just now letting you hear it. "You're calculating," she said. "Calculating what?" "How far you could swim if you had to." I almost laughed. 11 miles in the North Pacific? I'd make it about 400 meters. 300. The current runs north here. You'd burn out fighting the drift. She sat on the rock beside me, pulling her jacket tighter. "My family's in Busan. My mother, my brother, his 2 kids. I called them before the satellite went out." My mother answered. She said the military had set up a perimeter around the neighborhood, but she could hear gunfire moving closer. She told me to stay where I was. She told me she loved me. Then the line dropped. I didn't say I was sorry. I didn't say it would be okay. I'd learned in 3 days that those phrases were a kind of currency that had already been devalued to nothing. "I keep thinking about the clip from the hospital," she said. "The one from Frankfurt, the way they moved." It wasn't random. There was a pattern, like they were orienting towards sound or heat or something we haven't identified yet. If we're going to survive this, we need to understand what they are. Not just avoid them, understand them. We're marine biologists, Jin Seo. We're scientists. The methodology transfers. She said it with such calm certainty that for a moment I believed her. Then the wind picked up and the temperature dropped. And I remembered that we were 6 people on a rock in the ocean with 5 weeks of canned food and a whiteboard that said current situation. And methodology felt very far from enough. That night, I lay in my bunk and listened to the rain on the station's metal roof. In the room next door, I could hear Donna and Marcus murmuring to each other. Their voices too low to make out words. Just the rhythm of 2 people reassuring each other in the dark. Above me, Caleb's bunk was empty. I found him later in the kitchen, sitting at the table with his legal pad, redoing the food calculations by lantern light. He'd added a new column. It was labeled Rationing, Week 6 plus. You said 5 weeks, I said. 5 weeks at current consumption. But current consumption assumes we're not burning extra calories, fortifying, hauling, chopping wood, or panicking. Stress burns energy. Fear burns energy. I'm adjusting. He looked up. His glasses reflected the lantern flame in duplicate. I was supposed to be on a ferry home in 12 days. My daughter's recital is in 3 weeks. She's playing Debussy. She's been practicing for months. He went back to his numbers. I went back to my bunk. The rain didn't stop. On the morning of day 4, Marcus found the first sign that our isolation might not be as complete as we thought. He was checking the eastern shoreline when he noticed debris caught in the rocks near the tidal pools. A life jacket, standard marine issue, bright orange, shredded along one side. Not torn by rocks. The fabric was ripped outward from the inside, as though whatever had been wearing it had expanded or convulsed violently enough to split the seams. There was blood on the inside lining, dark, almost black, and tacky despite the salt water. He brought it back without touching it directly, carrying it on the end of a boat hook. Lena examined it on the dock while the rest of us kept our distance. She turned it over carefully, reading the ID tag stitched into the collar. Canadian Coast Guard Auxiliary, she said. This is from a rescue vessel. How far could it have drifted? I asked. Depends on the current. But with the tide pattern we've had, not far, maybe a few miles. Nobody said what we were all computing. A few miles meant the mainland's crisis had already reached the water. Lena made a rule after the life jacket. No one goes to the shoreline alone. Pairs at minimum, always with a radio, always with a check-in time. If a pair missed their window by 15 minutes, the rest of us mobilized. She didn't frame it as fear. She framed it as protocol, borrowing the language of field safety procedures we'd all internalized during station orientation. Buddy system, communication schedule, risk assessment. The words sounded almost normal if you didn't look too closely at why we needed them. Marcus and I took the first paired patrol that afternoon, walking the perimeter of the island from the station dock clockwise around the southern bluff, past the old equipment shed, and along the exposed western ridge where the wind was strong enough to make conversation difficult. The island was small. You could walk its full circumference in about 3 hours at a steady pace. But the terrain was uneven, the forest dense in patches, and there were coves and inlets where the rock folded into blind corners that you couldn't see around until you were already in them. We didn't find anything on that first patrol. No more debris, no movement in the water, no sound except wind and surf, and the occasional complaint of a bald eagle somewhere in the canopy. but the act of walking the shoreline with intent, not as scientists looking for specimens, but as sentries looking for threat, changed the island beneath my feet. Every shadow in the tree line had weight. Every shifting sound in the underbrush demanded interpretation. Marcus felt it too. I could tell by the way he walked, slightly forward on his toes, shoulders tight, head tracking left to right in a sweep pattern that looked almost military. "You've done this before," I said. "Not here, but this kind of thing." "National Guard. 4 years right out of high school. Never deployed, but they train you. Situational awareness, perimeter assessment, threat response. I thought it was wasted time. Spent 20 years fixing pipes and wiring panels, and the thing my brain kept sharpest was how to clear a sight line." He stopped at the edge of a rocky inlet and scanned the water. "Dana doesn't know how scared I am. I need her not to know. She handles fear by needing to see that I'm handling fear. If I crack, she spirals. Is that sustainable?" "Nothing about this is sustainable, Elliot. We're buying time. That's all any of this is." We finished the patrol and reported back clean. Caleb had spent the afternoon reinforcing the station's ground floor windows with plywood from the equipment shed, working with a focused efficiency that belied the fact that he'd never boarded a window in his life. Dana had organized the pantry into a precise grid, labeled with masking tape and marker, each item tagged with calorie count and expiration date. Jin Seo had set up a crude observation log on her laptop, offline, battery conserved, where she was compiling everything we'd collectively seen or heard about the infected, trying to extract behavioral patterns from the fragments. "It's incomplete," she admitted when I looked over her shoulder. "But patterns don't need complete data sets. They need consistency. And the consistent elements are these: rapid onset, apparent loss of higher cognitive function, persistence of motor coordination, and attraction to sensory stimuli. Sound, specifically. Every account we caught before the feeds died mentioned sound as a primary trigger. So we stay quiet. We stay aware that noise is a variable we can control. That's not nothing." It wasn't nothing, but standing in that lab, watching a 24-year-old master's student try to build an epidemiological model from cached news clips and secondhand panic, I felt the full absurdity of our position. We were researchers. We measured things. We observed, recorded, analyzed, published. The scientific method was designed for systems that held still long enough to be studied. Whatever was happening on the mainland was not holding still. Lena called a meeting after dinner. She'd added to the whiteboard. Below current situation, she'd written 3 categories: assets, threats, decisions. Under assets: food stores, fresh water, 2 boats, generator fuel, tools, first aid, 6 personnel with mixed skill sets. Under threats, she'd written only 1 item. She didn't need to label it. Under decisions, 3 questions. Do we attempt mainland contact? Do we fortify or prepare to relocate? What is our threshold for action? Threshold for action, Caleb repeated. Meaning what triggers us to change strategy. Meaning what has to happen before we stop waiting and start moving. Because right now, we're in a holding pattern. Holding patterns are comfortable. They're also how people starve. The debate lasted 2 hours. Caleb pushed again for a scouting trip. Lena resisted. Marcus proposed a compromise. Take the Zodiac, hug the coast, get within visual range of the mainland port without landing, and report back. Dana asked what would happen if what they saw was worse than what they imagined. Jin Seo asked what decision framework we'd use to evaluate the information, even if we got it. No consensus. Lena tabled it for the morning, but something had shifted in the room. The holding pattern had a name now, and naming it made it heavier. We weren't just waiting. We were choosing to wait. And every hour that passed made that choice more expensive. I went outside after the meeting. The sky had cleared for the first time in days, and the stars were enormous, the way they only get when there's no light pollution for 100 miles in any direction. I stood on the dock and looked north toward open ocean, and for one disorienting moment, I couldn't tell where the water ended and the sky began. The whole world was dark, and we were a single point of warmth in the middle of it. Burning diesel to keep the lights on. Somewhere behind me, the generator hummed its steady, indifferent note. Somewhere beyond the horizon, cities were falling silent. And somewhere between the two, in the black water I couldn't see, something was drifting toward us. I saw the boat first. It was just after dawn on day 5. The light still low and metallic, the water barely distinguishable from the sky. I'd taken the early watch. We'd started sleeping in shifts after the life jacket, 2 people awake at all times, and I was standing on the eastern bluff with a pair of binoculars and a thermos of instant coffee that tasted like rust. The boat appeared at the edge of the fog bank to the southeast, drifting with the current, no engine sound, no running lights. A white hull maybe 35 feet long, the kind of recreational cruiser you'd see moored at any marina along the coast. It was listing slightly to starboard, moving in the lazy, purposeless way that objects move when no one is steering them. I radioed Lena. She was at the station within 4 minutes, Marcus right behind her. By the time the 6 of us had gathered on the bluff, the current had brought the boat close enough to see details without binoculars. The name on the stern was Second Wind, registered out of Campbell River. The cabin door was open. The deck was empty. A fishing rod was still mounted in the stern holder, its line trailing in the water like a long, thin nerve. "Nobody's on it," Dana said. "Nobody's visible," Lena corrected. We watched for 20 minutes as the current carried it closer. It was heading for the rocky shallows on the island's eastern side, where the seafloor rose sharply and the waves broke over jagged basalt shelves. If no one intervened, the boat would ground itself within the hour, probably damage its hull, and either sink in the shallows or lodge itself in the rocks. "We should bring it in," Caleb said. "That's fuel, supplies, maybe a working radio. We can't afford to let it wreck." "We don't know what's on that boat," Lena said. "I can see the entire deck from here. It's empty. The cabin isn't." The silence that followed was the loudest one we'd shared yet. Everyone understood what Lena was implying. The cabin door was open, but the interior was dark, and from our angle on the bluff, we couldn't see inside. The boat could be carrying supplies, fuel, fresh water, a working satellite phone, any number of things that would materially improve our chances. It could also be carrying something else. Marcus spoke first. "I'll take the Zodiac out. Pull alongside, clear the deck, check the cabin. If it's clean, I tow it back to the dock. If it's not, I disengage and come back. And if what's inside is faster than you." Dana's voice was controlled, but her hand found his arm and gripped. "Then I'll be faster." Lena waited. I watched her process, the slight narrowing of her eyes, the way she pressed her thumb against her index finger when she was running internal calculations. She'd spent 20 years making risk assessments in the field. Dive conditions, weather windows, equipment reliability. This was different in every way that mattered and identical in the one way that counted. Someone had to decide, and the decision had consequences. "Marcus and Elliot," she said, "take the Zodiac. Approach from the port side, away from the cabin door. Clear line of sight before anyone boards. You take one of the axes from the equipment shed. If anything moves on that boat that shouldn't be moving, you disengage. No heroics, no second chances. I didn't volunteer. She assigned me. I think she chose me because I was the least likely to argue and the most likely to follow Marcus's lead without improvising. She was right on both counts. Marcus handed me the shorter of the two felling axes from the shed. It was heavier than I expected, the blade dull from years of firewood duty, but still solid steel. He took the longer one. We loaded them into the Zodiac alongside the tow line and the emergency kit. And Marcus started the outboard with a single pull. The motor caught, impossibly loud in the morning silence. And I saw Jinseo wince on the bluff above us. Sound is a variable we can control. The crossing took less than 10 minutes. The second wind was drifting slowly enough that we overtook it easily, circling wide to approach from the port side as instructed. Up close, the boat looked wrong in ways I hadn't noticed from shore. The hull was scratched and dented along the waterline, not from rocks, but from repeated impact against something solid. A dock, another vessel, something it had been banging against for hours or days without anyone aboard to fend it off. The deck was streaked with salt residue and bird droppings, but beneath that, there were marks, smears, dark against the white fiberglass, concentrated near the cabin door and the starboard rail. Marcus killed the outboard and let us drift alongside. He tied off to a deck cleat, then stood in the Zodiac, axe in hand, and looked at me. "Stay in the Zodiac. I'm going aboard. If I tell you to cut the line, you cut it and go. You don't wait for me to get back in. You go." "Marcus, say it back to me. If you say cut, I cut the line and go." He climbed onto the deck. The boat shifted under his weight, and I heard water slap against the hull in a rhythm that sounded almost biological, like a pulse. Marcus moved across the deck in a low, balanced stance. Weight on his toes, axe held diagonally across his chest. He checked the bow first. Nothing. Just a coiled anchor line and a sun-bleached cooler. He moved aft, checking behind the center console, scanning the port side bench seats that lined the cockpit. Empty. The fishing rod in its holder swayed slightly with the boat's motion, and the trailing line made a thin cutting sound against the water. Then he reached the cabin door. From my position in the Zodiac, I could see about half the interior through the open doorway. Steps led down into a small galley and berth area. The lights were off, but enough dawn light angled in to illuminate the first few feet. A counter with dishes still in the sink, a chart book open on the navigation table, and a dark stain on the carpet of the lower step that spread outward in a shape that didn't look accidental. Marcus paused at the door. He tapped the axe handle against the door frame. 3 sharp knocks, deliberate, percussive. We waited. Nothing moved below. No sound, no shift in weight. He knocked again, harder. The boat rocked gently. The water slapped. Silence. He descended the steps. I lost sight of him for maybe 40 seconds. Those were the longest seconds of the 5 days. I gripped the tow line with one hand and the Zodiac's grab handle with the other. And I watched the cabin doorway like it was a mouth about to speak. When he reappeared, he was carrying a duffel bag in one hand, his axe still in the other. His face was set in an expression I'd later learned to recognize. The controlled blankness of someone who's seen something they're not ready to describe. "It's clear," he said. "Nobody's aboard. The stain on the... There's blood in the cabin. A lot of it. On the berth, the walls, the floor. But no body. No remains. Whatever happened here, whoever was on this boat, they're not on it anymore." He handed me the duffel bag and went back below. Over the next 15 minutes, he passed up everything useful. A handheld VHF radio, dead battery but functional. A first aid kit better stocked than ours. A flare gun with 4 cartridges. A filleting knife, 3 cans of fuel, a case of bottled water, a waterproof bag containing charts of the local coastal waters, and, this felt like finding gold, a compact solar panel designed for charging small electronics. We towed the second wind back to the dock. The group met us there, and Marcus delivered his report in that flat, factual tone that people use when emotion would cost too much. Lena examined the charts. Caleb took the fuel cans. Jin Seo immediately began working on the radio, pulling the battery to evaluate whether it could be charged with a solar panel. I was the one who asked the question no one else wanted to voice. If there's no one on the boat, and there's blood all over the cabin, where did they go? Lena looked at the water. The gray, indifferent, 11-mile-wide water. Over the side, she said quietly. Either they jumped, or they were pulled, or they turned, and they walked off the deck the way you'd walk through a door, because whatever's left of them doesn't understand drowning. That image settled into me like a splinter. Not the violence of it, the indifference. A body walking off the edge of a boat into dark water because the part of the brain that recognized danger had been overwritten. It wasn't malice. It wasn't even hunger, not in any way I understood. It was erasure. The person who'd owned that boat, who'd mounted that fishing rod, who'd left dishes in the sink because they expected to wash them later, that person was gone. What remained was just enough locomotion to reach the rail and keep walking. Dana handled the discovery differently. She went quiet, not the contemplative quiet of someone processing, but the airless quiet of someone retreating inward. Marcus stayed close to her that afternoon, working on the boat's engine within her line of sight, making sure she could see him whenever she looked up. Their dynamic had shifted since the outbreak. Before, they'd been easy with each other, the kind of couple that finishes each other's sentences with affectionate eye rolls. Now Marcus orbited Dana like a satellite, and Dana held still at the center, as though movement itself had become a risk. Jin Seo got the radio working by evening. The solar panel needed hours to build a meaningful charge, but she jury-rigged a connection to one of the station's backup batteries, and by dinner we had a functional VHF. Lena tried the Coast Guard frequency. Static. She tried the mainland marina. Static. She tried every channel she could remember, speaking our station ID and coordinates into the void with the mechanical persistence of someone depositing coins into a machine that hasn't paid out in months. On Channel 16, the international distress frequency, she caught something. Not a voice. A sound. Rhythmic, guttural, wet, like breathing through a throat full of fluid. It lasted maybe 15 seconds before it dissolved into static. Lena turned off the radio and set it on the counter. "We're not trying that frequency again," she said. Nobody argued. The night after the boat arrived, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bunk listening to the station breathe, the generators hum, the wind testing the windows, the creak of the building shifting on its foundation. And I thought about the sound on Channel 16. I told myself it could have been interference, signal degradation, atmospheric distortion, the radio equivalent of pareidolia. But my body didn't believe my brain, and my body was the one keeping me awake, muscles tight, pulse elevated, every ambient noise sharpened to a point. I got up around 2 in the morning and found Jin Seo in the lab. She hadn't gone to bed. She was sitting in the glow of her laptop screen, the brightness turned down to minimum. surrounded by printed sheets she'd laid out on the bench in a grid pattern. Each sheet contained a handwritten timeline, an observation, or a diagram. She'd been building something. "I can't sleep either," she said without looking up. "So I'm being useful instead." What is this? Everything I know, everything we know, organized. She pointed to the grid. Behavioral observations along the top, environmental factors on the left axis, transmission variables down the right. I'm looking for correlations. From news clips and one shredded life jacket. And the boat. The boat tells us something important. She pulled one of the sheets toward her. The blood pattern in the cabin. Marcus described it as concentrated on the berth and walls, with drag marks toward the steps. That suggests the person was attacked while sleeping or resting, then either moved themselves or was moved toward the exit. But there's no body, no remains on deck. And the boat was still running when it left its point of origin. The engine was in gear just out of fuel. That means someone or something started the engine and pointed the boat to sea. An infected person started a boat engine. Or the person started the engine before they turned, trying to escape, then turned mid-crossing and went over the side. Or, and this is the possibility that concerns me, an infected individual retained enough motor memory to operate simple machinery. The implication of that hung in the air between us. If the infected could open doors, climb steps, start engines, if they could perform learned physical actions without conscious direction, then the barrier between us and them wasn't intelligence. It was water. And water, as the second wind had just demonstrated, could be crossed by a boat that nobody was steering. "I keep thinking about my niece," Jinseo said after a long pause. "She's 6. She was learning to ride a bicycle when I left. My brother sent me a video the week before the outbreak. She was so proud." She pressed her fingertips against the printed sheet until the paper dimpled. "Motor memory. That's all riding a bicycle is. Motor memory. If this thing preserves motor memory." She stopped. I understood why. The thought she was approaching was a cliff edge, and looking over it would not help either of us. "We need to talk about the water," she said, redirecting. "The boat didn't get here by accident. The current brought it. That means the current connects us to whatever's happening over there. Anything that goes into the water on the mainland side, debris, fuel, bodies, can reach us. We need to start monitoring the eastern shoreline systematically, every tide cycle, looking for changes." I agreed. It was practical, scientific, and it gave us something to do besides wait and imagine. We drew up a monitoring schedule on a fresh sheet, 6-hour intervals aligned with tidal patterns, a checklist of observable indicators, a protocol for handling anything biological. It felt like building a sandcastle against a tidal wave. But sandcastles were all we had. The next morning, day 6, Caleb pulled me aside after breakfast. He'd been recalculating again. The yellow legal pad was getting dense, the margins filled with increasingly cramped figures. "I've been thinking about the threshold question," he said. "Lena's question from the meeting. What triggers us to change strategy? I think the answer is simpler than we made it. The threshold isn't an event. It's a number. When our food drops below 3 weeks of supply, we have to move. That's the hard boundary. Below 3 weeks, we don't have enough margin to execute a supply run to the mainland and recover from a failed attempt. We have to go while we still have enough to try twice. You've done the math. I've done the math. At current consumption, we hit 3 weeks of remaining supply in 16 days. If we ration aggressively, maybe 22. Either way, that's our window. We use the next 2 to 3 weeks to prepare, plan, and gather intelligence. And then we go. Or we don't go. And we start measuring how slowly 6 people can starve on a rock. He said it without drama, just numbers. But the precision of it was its own kind of violence. The way mathematics can pin down a future you'd rather leave blurry, I told Lena. She didn't argue with the math. She argued with the assumption. Caleb's calculation assumes we can't supplement. But we're sitting on an ocean full of protein. We have fishing gear, crab traps, the knowledge to harvest intertidal species. I didn't spend 20 years studying this ecosystem to starve next to it. Can we catch enough? Consistently? I don't know. But we extend the timeline, and every extra day is a day something might change. She paused. I'm not naive. I know something might change isn't a strategy, but neither is a supply run to a coast we can't see with no information about what's waiting there. I need more data before I send anyone across that water. 2 leaders, 2 logics, both correct, both incomplete. The tension between them would define the next 10 days of our lives, and end one of them. We settled into a rhythm that wasn't quite routine but served as its imitation. Morning patrol of the shoreline in pairs, tidal monitoring checks every 6 hours, fishing operations from the dock and the sheltered cove on the south side, where Lena showed us how to set crab pots using bait from our diminishing pantry. Generator maintenance, firewood, water collection, the work filled the hours, and the hours were easier when they were full. Lena's instinct about marine harvesting proved partially right. The waters around the island were productive. Rockfish, lingcod, and Dungeness crab were all available in enough quantity to supplement our stores. But supplement was the operative word. The caloric yield was inconsistent, weather-dependent, and demanded time and energy that competed with every other survival task. On a good day, we added maybe 2,000 calories to our collective supply. On a bad day, rain, rough seas, empty traps. We burned more harvesting than we gained. Caleb updated his numbers accordingly, and the legal pad told a story of diminishing margins. The timeline stretched by a few days, but didn't fundamentally change the calculus. We were still measuring our future in weeks. On day 8, the second piece of debris arrived. Dana found it during the afternoon tidal check. A section of dock planking, roughly 4 feet long, studded with cleats and splintered at both ends as though it had been torn from a larger structure. It had floated into the sheltered cove and lodged between 2 rocks in the shallows. Unremarkable, except for what was attached to it. A hand. Human. Severed cleanly at the wrist, fingers still curled around the dock cleat in a grip that had outlasted the arm it belonged to. The skin was gray-white, waterlogged but not decomposed. Too recent for significant bacterial breakdown, Lena said when she examined it. The nails were intact. The tendons were visible where the wrist had separated, pale and fibrous. And the exposed bone was splintered in a way that suggested tearing force, not a blade. Dana didn't scream. She told me later that she'd wanted to, that the scream had been right there in her throat like a physical object. But what came out instead was a sound she described as organizational. A rapid, clipped verbal inventory of what she was seeing, delivered to no one, as if cataloging the horror could contain it. Hand, attached to dock segment. Gray coloration, grip intact, severed at wrist. No wedding ring. Male probably. Recent. We removed it from the cove using the boat hook, the same one Marcus had used for the life jacket. Lena wanted to examine it more closely. Jin Seo wanted samples. Tissue, if possible, to look for visible pathological changes, even without lab-grade equipment. We don't know if this thing transmits through contact, Caleb objected. We don't know if it's in the tissue, the blood, the fluid. You're talking about cutting into something that might be carrying the infection. We're wearing gloves. We have the biosafety protocols from the marine pathogen kit. And if it does transmit through tissue contact, we need to know that, because we're standing on an island surrounded by water that's bringing this to us. Jin Seo's voice was steady, but I could see the effort it cost. A faint tremor in her hands that she stilled by pressing them flat against the lab bench. Lena authorized a limited examination. Gloves, goggles, the station's small collection of dissection tools. Jin Seo performed it alone in the lab, while the rest of us waited in the common room, which felt medieval. The doctor behind closed doors, the village outside, hoping for news that wouldn't come. She emerged after an hour. Her face held that look I'd seen on Marcus after the boat. Controlled blankness, information being held at arm's length until it could be processed. "The tissue is abnormal," she said. "I don't have a microscope powerful enough for cellular analysis, but at the gross level, the musculature is different, denser. The tendons are thicker than they should be for a hand this size. And the grip, the reason the fingers are still locked around that cleat, is because the muscles appear to have contracted permanently. Rigor mortis doesn't do this. Rigor releases after a period. This is structural. Whatever this infection does, it changes the physical tissue. It's not just neurological, it's morphological." The room was silent. "Stronger," Marcus said. Not a question. Different, reconfigured. I can't say how much or what the upper limit is or whether it's uniform. But whatever these people become, they're not just human bodies running on corrupted software. The hardware is changing too. I watched each person absorb that information and store it somewhere different. Caleb wrote something on his legal pad. Dana closed her eyes. Marcus shifted his weight onto the balls of his feet, an unconscious preparation that his body remembered even when his mind was still catching up. Lena stared at the whiteboard. Under threats, she added a second line. She wrote, "Physical change confirmed." And then she drew a circle around both threat entries so firm the markers squeaked against the surface. The fog rolled in on day 9 and didn't lift. A gray, wet compression of the world that reduced our visual range to maybe 100 meters on the water and turned the forest into a wall of muffled shapes. Sound behaved strangely in the fog. Distances collapsed. Directions became unreliable. And the ocean's ambient noise seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the island had been swallowed by a living thing that was breathing around us. We suspended the tidal monitoring protocol. You couldn't see the waterline from the bluff, couldn't track debris, couldn't distinguish between a wave shadow and something solid in the water. Lena pulled everyone inside except for paired watch shifts on the dock, where at least the fixed reference points, pilings, cleats, the moored boats, gave some orientation. I was on watch with Caleb that afternoon when we heard it. A low, sustained sound from the water to the east. Not mechanical, no engine rhythm, no propeller cavitation. Organic, a vocalization of some kind, but not one I could categorize. Not a whale, not a seal, not a bird. It had a tonal quality that sat in an uncomfortable range. Too low for a scream, too structured for groaning. With a wet, aspirated quality that made me think of the sound on Channel 16. Like breathing through saturated tissue. It lasted about 30 seconds. Then it stopped, and the fog swallowed the silence that followed. Caleb and I looked at each other. He was gripping his legal pad so hard the cardboard backing was bending. "Wind," he said. That wasn't wind. It was wind through a rock formation or a seal in distress. or acoustic distortion from the fog layer. Caleb, I know what it sounded like. I'm telling you what it was. His voice had the brittle precision of someone constructing a wall out of denial and mortaring it with syntax. I didn't push. I understood the impulse. Some truths are easier to carry if you refuse to name them for as long as possible. We reported it to Lena, who logged it without interpretation. Jin Seo added it to her observation matrix. Marcus checked the boats, confirmed the mooring lines, and added a second tie to each. Dana retreated to the room she shared with Marcus and didn't come out until dinner. The sound didn't recur that day, but the fog didn't lift, and the island felt smaller than it had before, contracted by the loss of visual range into a tight, damp pocket of known space, surrounded by an unknown that had just announced itself. That night, dinner was canned chili heated over the wood stove. We ate in near silence, the kind that comes not from having nothing to say, but from having too much. Lena broke it. I've reconsidered Caleb's proposal, she said. Not the mainland run, not yet. But Marcus's compromise. A visual reconnaissance. Take the Zodiac east at first light if the fog clears. Stay a mile offshore. Use the binoculars. Get a look at the coast and come back. No landing, no approach, no contact. Who goes? Marcus asked. You and Elliot. You've already paired effectively. And Elliot has the most familiarity with the coastal geography from his kelp surveys. I felt the assignment land in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. She was right. I'd spent dozens of hours on the water between the island and the mainland, running transect lines through the kelp forests, noting landmarks, learning the shapes of the coastline. I knew where the marina was, where the town of Port McNeil spread along the shore, where the logging roads came down to the water. I could read that coast the way a native reads a face. If the fog clears, I said. If the fog clears. It didn't clear the next day, or the next. 3 days of gray compression, during which the island shrank further, the food stores dropped, and the sound from the water came twice more, once at night, once at dawn, each time from a slightly different bearing, each time lasting a little longer. Jinseo plotted the bearings on the coastal chart from the second wind and drew a line from each one toward the mainland. They converge, she said, showing me the chart in the lab. 3 lines, originating from slightly different points in the water, all pointing back to a stretch of coast just south of Port McNeil. Whatever is making that sound, it's coming from the same general area. And it's getting closer. How can you tell it's getting closer? Volume. The first instance was barely audible. The second was clear enough to distinguish tonal qualities. The third, the one this morning, I could hear it from inside the station with the windows closed. She looked at me with an expression that was not fear, exactly, but its more precise cousin, the recognition of a pattern you wish you hadn't found. Something is in the water between us and the mainland, and it's moving this direction. I looked at the chart. 11 miles of open ocean, 3 converging lines, and at their far end, a coastline we could no longer see, hosting a population we could no longer reach, undergoing a transformation we could barely describe. The fog lifted on day 12. Morning light hit the station windows like a detonation. After 3 days of gray compression, the sudden clarity was almost painful. The ocean gone from matty opacity to glittering infinite blue. The mainland visible as a dark line in the eastern horizon. The sky scrubbed clean and sharp. I stood on the dock and squinted and felt my pupils contract and thought, I can see everything now, and I'm not sure I want to. Marcus and I launched the Zodiac at 0700. Lena gave us a 2-hour window, radio check every 15 minutes. Maximum approach distance, 1 mile from shore. If we saw anything on the water, anything, we turned back immediately. The crossing was calm, too calm. The ocean had the glassy, held breath quality of water that's waiting for something. Marcus drove, and I sat in the bow with the binoculars, scanning the surface ahead. For the first 20 minutes, I saw nothing but water and light and the occasional dark ribbon of a kelp canopy just below the surface. The mainland grew larger on the horizon, resolving from a line into a landscape. The dark green of coniferous forest, the gray of rock, the geometric shapes of human construction along the shore. We reached our observation distance, and Marcus killed the engine. We drifted. Port McNeil was visible to the north, maybe 4 miles along the coast. I raised the binoculars and found the town. The marina first. I knew its shape from dozens of supply runs. What I saw made me lower the binoculars, breathe, and raise them again. The marina was destroyed. Not damaged, destroyed. The floating docks were partially submerged, broken at their hinge points, several segments missing entirely. Boats were capsized, grounded, or tangled together in clusters that looked like they'd been driven by a storm surge, except there hadn't been a storm. The fuel dock was blackened. A fire had gutted it. And the harbor master's office, a small white building I'd walked past 100 times, was just a frame. No roof, no walls, just studs standing like a rib cage picked clean. Beyond the marina, the town. I scanned slowly, methodically, the way Lena had taught me to survey a transect. Buildings intact but dark. Windows broken in some, boarded in others. Cars visible on the main road, most stationary, several at angles that suggested they'd stopped in a hurry. Doors open, one flipped onto its side. No smoke, no light, no movement. Anything? Marcus asked. Structural damage throughout. Fire damage at the marina. No sign of active population. No one at all? I kept scanning. The town's main street ran parallel to the shore for about half a mile before curving inland. I followed it with the binoculars, building by building. The grocery store, the hardware shop, the elementary school with its painted mural of orcas that I'd seen every supply day. All dark, all still. Then I reached the parking lot behind the community center, and I stopped. There were people, dozens of them, standing in the lot in loose clusters, motionless, facing no particular direction. They weren't interacting with each other. They weren't sitting or crouching or lying down. They were simply standing, like machines that had been switched to idle. Some were dressed normally, jeans, jackets, work clothes. Others were partially clothed or wearing hospital gowns. One figure near the edge of the lot was wearing a high-visibility vest, the kind road workers wear, and was standing with its arms at its sides, head tilted at an angle that was maybe 15 degrees past where a human neck should comfortably go. "I see them," I said. 30, maybe 40, in the community center parking lot. They're not moving. Not moving toward us. Not moving at all, just standing. Marcus took the binoculars. He looked for a long time. When he lowered them, the controlled blankness was back. But underneath it, I could see something new. Something that looked like grief being actively converted into tactical information. Dormant state, he said. Like Jin Seo was hypothesizing. They're responsive to stimuli but default to stillness. Energy conservation, maybe. Or they're waiting for a trigger. Sound, light, vibration. We don't know the full list. He handed the binoculars back. "We've seen enough. Let's go." I took one more look before we turned back. This time I panned down from the town to the shoreline. the rocky beach that ran between the marina and the first residential pier. And there, at the waterline, I saw what Jin Seo's converging lines had been pointing to. Figures in the water. Not swimming, not floating. Standing, chest deep, facing the ocean. 7, 8, maybe 10 of them, distributed along a 100-meter stretch of shoreline, motionless in the surf. The waves broke against their bodies, and they didn't react. They just stood there, facing outward, toward open water. Toward us. I lowered the binoculars and told Marcus to go. The debriefing was the worst hour of my life up to that point. Not because of what I reported, the destroyed marina, the dormant clusters, the figures in the water, but because of what the information did to each person in the room. I watched it land differently in every face, and I watched it break something specific in each one. Caleb heard destroyed marina and understood that his supply run plan had just lost its primary infrastructure. Even if we reached the mainland, there was nowhere safe to dock, no fuel station intact, no staged provisions waiting. His legal pad sat untouched in his lap for the first time since day 3. Dana heard figures in the water and pressed both hands over her mouth, not dramatically, slowly, deliberately, as if she were holding something in. Marcus sat beside her and didn't touch her, which I think was harder for him than anything he'd done on the boat. Jin Seo heard dormant state and facing outward, and immediately began asking questions. How far apart were they standing? Were they evenly spaced or clustered? Did their orientation suggest attraction to a stimulus or a patrol-like distribution? I answered as precisely as I could, and each answer made her expression more focused and more frightened, because the pattern she was seeing confirmed something she'd suspected and hoped she was wrong about. They're not wandering into the water accidentally, she said. They're positioning. That's directed behavior. Low level, maybe reflexive, but directed. If they're standing in the surf line facing the ocean, they're responding to something on the other side, something they can detect from the shore. Us, Marcus said. Not necessarily us specifically, but something. A sound signature, a vibration pattern, a thermal differential. The island generates all of those. We run a diesel generator 24 hours a day. We use power tools. We talk. We move. At 11 miles, most of that would be undetectable to a human ear. But we don't know what their sensory thresholds are anymore. Jin Seo pulled up her observation matrix. Every modification we've confirmed suggests enhancement, not degradation. Denser musculature, persistent motor function. If their auditory processing has been similarly altered, then they can hear us, Lena finished. The room went very still. We shut down the generator, Lena said. Tonight. We go dark and cold and quiet. We cook on the wood stove, conserve battery power, and eliminate every unnecessary sound source. If they're orienting on our noise footprint, we reduce it to 0. And then what? Caleb's voice had a sharp edge I hadn't heard before. We sit in the dark and wait for them to lose interest? For how long? We're on a timeline, Lena. Every day we spend hiding is a day closer to a food boundary we can't negotiate. And every sound we make is a signal to a mainland full of things that are apparently standing in the ocean, waiting for a reason to start walking. They can't walk 11 miles underwater. We don't know that. Lena's voice didn't rise. It compressed. We don't know what they can do. 3 days ago, we didn't know they could operate boat engines. 2 days ago, we didn't know their tissue was restructuring. This morning, we found out they're standing in the surf like they're waiting for a bus. Every assumption we've made about their limitations has been wrong. I'm not going to add they probably can't cross open water to that list and bet our lives on it. The argument didn't have a winner. It had an outcome. Lena's authority held. She was the station director, the most experienced, the one who'd been making decisions for the group since day one. And the generator went off that evening. The sudden silence was enormous. I hadn't realized how completely the generator's hum had become the baseline of our existence until it was gone. And what replaced it was raw, unmediated sound. Wind, wave, wood, breath. The island without its machine heartbeat sounded ancient and exposed. We lit candles. We heated water on the wood stove. We spoke in lowered voices, not whispering but modulated, as if we'd all independently concluded that volume was now a resource to be conserved. Dinner was cold canned vegetables and smoked fish from the day's catch, eaten in the common room by candlelight. And if the circumstances had been different, it would have been almost beautiful, 6 people gathered around a shared table in warm, flickering light. Marcus broke the quiet. I want to fortify the dock, chain the boats, reinforce the pilings, create a choke point at the ramp. If anything comes out of the water, the dock is where it reaches us first. Quietly, Lena said. Quietly. Hand tools, no power equipment. I can do most of it with rope and lumber. I'll help, I said, not because I was skilled, because I needed to do something with my hands, or I was going to start counting the minutes until Caleb's food threshold arrived. And that way led to a paralysis I couldn't afford. That night, I stood at the common room window and looked out at the black water. Without the generator's lights, the station was invisible from the sea. No glow, no hum, no electromagnetic signature. Just a dark shape on a dark island in a dark ocean. I told myself that was safety. I told myself darkness was a wall. But walls only work if the thing outside can't find the door. 4 days of silence. 4 days of cold meals, whispered conversations, and the slow, careful work of fortification. Marcus and I reinforced the dock with doubled mooring lines and a barricade of lumber across the access ramp, creating a bottleneck that could be blocked with a heavy crossbeam. We stacked rocks along the most accessible stretches of shoreline, not as a wall, but as an early warning system. Anything coming out of the water would have to cross unstable footing, and we'd hear the stones shift. The silence was working, or at least nothing suggested it wasn't. Jin Seo's tidal monitoring, conducted in absolute quiet using hand signals when possible, showed no new debris, no biological material, no sign that anything from the mainland had reached our shores since we went dark. The sound from the water didn't return. The fog stayed away. The ocean was calm and empty and offered no information in either direction. The group began to fracture along a line I should have seen earlier. It wasn't Caleb versus Lena, though that tension remained. It was a subtler division. Those who believed silence could hold, and those who believed it was only postponing something inevitable. Dinah was in the first camp. The quiet had helped her. Without the generator's constant reminder that they were dependent on infrastructure, she'd found a rhythm in manual work. Tending the wood stove, mending fishing nets, maintaining the rainwater system. She spoke less than she had before the outbreak, but what she said was deliberate and grounded. She'd found a version of herself that could function inside the crisis by shrinking her world to the size of the tasks in front of her. Caleb was in the second camp, and his patience was eroding visibly. The legal pad was now 3/4 full, and the numbers had stopped changing because there was nothing left to calculate. He knew the timeline, he knew the margins, and every silent day was a day spent in a holding pattern he'd already argued against. On the afternoon of day 15, he came to me. I was on the dock, retying a rope lashing that had loosened overnight. "I'm going to the mainland," he said, "tomorrow morning, with or without consensus. I stopped what I was doing. Lena won't authorize it. I'm not asking for authorization. I'm informing you. The Zodiac is sufficient for a solo crossing. I've studied the charts from the second wind. There's a boat launch 3 miles south of Port McNeil, away from the town center, surrounded by forest. Less likely to have a concentration of infected. I can land, move inland on foot to the highway, and reach the commercial district in maybe 90 minutes. I'm looking for canned goods, fuel, batteries, and medical supplies. Antibiotics specifically. Dana's been rationing the ibuprofen for her knee, and we're nearly out. If you go alone and something happens, we'll lose you and the Zodiac. If I don't go, we lose the window. 11 days to threshold, Elliot. 11 days. After that, we don't have the reserves to mount a supply run and recover from failure. It has to be now, or it becomes never. And never means we die here. He said it with the same flat precision he'd used for every calculation since day 3. The man spoke in numbers the way other people breathed. Involuntarily, necessarily, always. And his numbers were right. I couldn't argue with the math. I could only argue with the risk. And risk was the one variable his legal pad couldn't quantify. I told Lena that evening I expected anger. What I got was something worse, resignation. He's right about the timeline, she said. We were standing outside, beyond earshot of the others, speaking barely above a whisper. I've known for days. I've been hoping something would change. A signal, a rescue, a miracle. Nothing's changed. The ocean is exactly as empty as it was on day 1, and our pantry is measurably less full. So you'll authorize it? I'll do more than that. I'll go with him. I started to object, and she held up her hand. Marcus is the better choice to stay. He's the structural backbone of this group, literally and emotionally. Jin Seo is the analytical mind. Dana needs stability. You're the bridge between them. If Caleb and I don't come back, the 4 of you have the best chance of sustaining yourselves. If we do come back, we buy everyone another month. The calculation was clean and ruthless, and completely characteristic of the woman who'd made it. Lena had spent her career making field decisions where the variables were weather, tide, and dive tables. She'd simply expanded the framework to include survival probability and personnel allocation. The fact that she was categorizing herself as expendable was not an oversight. It was the math. They left at dawn on day 16. Caleb at the tiller of the Zodiac, Lena in the bow with the binoculars, both carrying axes and the flare gun. The rest of us stood on the dock and watched them motor east into the low morning light until the sound of the outboard faded, and the Zodiac became a dot, and the dot became nothing, and the ocean closed behind them like a sentence that refuses to end. Marcus went back to work on the barricade. Dana went to check the crab pots. Jin Seo went to the lab. I stayed on the dock, watching the empty horizon, and I waited. They missed the first radio check. 15 minutes past the scheduled time, no signal. I told myself the radio's battery was weak, the solar charge inconsistent. I told Marcus, who said nothing and kept working. They missed the second check. An hour now. Jin Seo came down to the dock with her laptop, as though being closer to the water would somehow improve reception. She sat on a crate and watched me hold the radio as if proximity to my anxiety might extract information from the static. The third check came and went. 90 minutes of silence. Marcus stopped working. He set down his tools, walked to the end of the dock, and stood with his arms crossed, staring east. His posture was rigid, the tendons in his neck visible, and I knew he was calculating the same thing I was. How long we should wait before we acknowledged that waiting was no longer a plan. At 2 hours and 10 minutes, the radio crackled. Island Station, this is Lena, do you copy? I almost dropped the handset. Copy. We hear you. What's your status? A pause. When she spoke again, her voice was compressed in a way I hadn't heard before. Not calm, not panicked, but stripped. Like she was speaking from a place where emotion was a luxury she'd already spent. We're at the boat launch. Caleb is injured. We need to come back, now. How bad? His leg. He fell on the rocks during landing. I've stabilized it, but he can't walk. I've loaded what I could from the nearest buildings. We're coming back. I need you to clear the dock barricade and be ready to receive us. And Elliot, yeah. Keep the radio off after this. Don't transmit again until you see us. We drew attention at the landing site, the sound of the engine. They were in the forest above the launch. We didn't see them until we were already on the rocks. They came out of the trees when they heard the motor. The radio went to static. I clipped it to my belt and turned to find Marcus already dismantling the dock barricade, pulling the crossbeam free with a focus that was almost violent. Jin Seo ran to the station to get the first aid kit. Dana appeared at the top of the dock ramp, and I watched the color leave her face as she registered the urgency. What happened? She asked. They're coming back. Caleb's hurt. We need to be ready. 26 minutes. That's how long it took from Lena's last transmission to the moment the Zodiac appeared around the island's eastern headland. I counted every one. The boat was riding low, weighted with supplies, and Lena was at the tiller, driving hard, the outboard screaming at full throttle. Caleb was lying in the bottom of the boat, his left leg wrapped in what looked like torn fabric, his face a color I associated with medical emergencies and not with the careful, precise man who counted calories on a legal pad. Marcus and I hauled them in. Caleb was semi-conscious, his breathing rapid and shallow. The leg was bad. A compound fracture of the tibia, the bone visible through a tear in his cargo pants. The wound already swelling with the angry red of contamination, or worse. Lena's hands were covered in his blood, and her jacket was missing. She'd torn it into the bandages wrapped around his leg. He slipped on the boat ramp, she said as we carried him up to the station. Covered in algae, angled wrong. His foot went one way, his body went another. I heard it break from 10 feet away. And the infected? At least a dozen. In the tree line above the launch. They were still dormant, the way you described. But the engine noise activated them. They started moving toward the sound. I had maybe 3 minutes between landing and the first one reaching the ramp. I got Caleb back in the boat and grabbed what I could carry from the nearest building. A storage shed, some canned goods, a toolbox, a jug of bleach. Then I ran the engine and got out. Did they follow you into the water? She was quiet for a moment. We were inside now, laying Caleb on the common room table. Jin Seo was already cutting away the pant leg, assessing the wound with the detached focus of someone running on adrenaline and training. Yes, Lena said. They walked in, just like you described, straight into the water, up to their waists. And then they stopped. They stood there, facing the boat. And the sound, that sound we heard from the water, they were making it. All of them, at once. This wet, low vocalization that wasn't a scream and wasn't a moan. It was something else. Like echolocation. Like they were mapping where I was going. She sat down heavily in a chair, her blood-covered hands resting on her knees. For the first time since I'd known her, Alina Murad looked exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix. I led them to us, she said. Not here, not directly. But they heard our engine. They tracked our direction. And now, they know something is out here. The weight of that settled over the room like silt over a riverbed. Slow, invisible, and absolutely permanent. We set Caleb's leg with materials from the first aid kit and the toolbox Lena had grabbed. A metal ruler splinted against the tibia with gauze and tape, the wound cleaned with the bleach solution diluted to concentration. Jin Seo did most of the work. She'd taken a wilderness first aid course before her field season, the kind of 2-day certification that teaches you to stabilize injuries until real help arrives. Real help was not arriving. Caleb was conscious but distant. The pain held at bay by the last of our ibuprofen in a psychological retreat I recognized as shock's quieter cousin. He lay on the table and stared at the ceiling and said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, it was to ask for his legal pad. Marcus brought it. Caleb held it against his chest like a talisman and closed his eyes. "The supplies she brought back," he murmured. "How much?" I inventoried them on the floor nearby. 14 cans of various vegetables and soups, a box of crackers partially crushed, 3 cans of tuna, the bleach, a small toolbox containing a hammer, pliers, a utility knife, and a roll of duct tape. Not nothing, but not the game-changing haul we'd needed. "Maybe 4 days extension," I said. 5 with rationing. He didn't open his eyes, but his hand found the pen in the legal pad's spiral binding and slid it free. And even lying on a table with a broken leg and no painkillers, Caleb Oren updated his numbers. We spent the rest of that day in a state I can only describe as compressed waiting. The kind of alert stillness that prey animals maintain when they know a predator is nearby but can't see it. Lena's report changed everything. The infected weren't just on the mainland. They were at the waterline, oriented toward the ocean, responsive to engine noise, and capable of the sound that Jin Seo had been tracking for days. A sound that now had a confirmed source and a confirmed function. They were listening. They were mapping. They were, in some rudimentary but undeniable way, hunting. Marcus finished the dock barricade and started on a secondary barrier at the station's ground floor entrance. A reinforced door brace using lumber and the heavy crossbeam from the equipment shed. He worked in silence, each hammer blow muffled by a folded towel pressed against the nailhead. A technique so absurd and so necessary that it became a perfect emblem of our situation. Building a fortress while trying not to be heard. Jin Seo updated her observation matrix with Lena's first-hand report and produced what she called a behavioral model, though she admitted the data was still dangerously thin. The infected exhibited 2 primary states: dormancy, characterized by motionless standing in groups, and activation, triggered by sound stimuli. Activated behavior included directed movement toward the sound source, vocalization, and entry into water. Deactivation threshold was unknown. Once triggered, it was unclear whether they returned to dormancy or remained in a heightened state. The vocalization appeared to function as both communication and echolocation, suggesting a social or swarm-like coordination mechanism. Physical capabilities were enhanced beyond baseline human parameters. Cognitive function was minimal but sufficient for basic environmental navigation, including terrain traversal and simple mechanical interaction. "What I can't model," she said, "is their response to prolonged stimulus versus a single event." Lena's engine was a one-time noise. They activated, they moved, they vocalized, and presumably they returned to some baseline state afterward. But what if the stimulus is sustained or repeated? What if they don't deactivate but instead escalate, move further, coordinate more effectively, attempt a crossing? "Attempt a crossing how?" Dana asked. It was the first time she'd spoken in hours, and her voice sounded like it was coming from further away than the chair she was sitting in. Walking. The continental shelf between the mainland and this island is shallow for the first few miles. After that, it drops off. But if they don't need to breathe at a normal rate, if the tissue changes extend to oxygen processing, they might be able to walk the seafloor for longer than we'd think. Maybe not 11 miles, but maybe further than is comfortable. You're speculating, Marcus said, not dismissively, carefully. He needed to know whether this was data or fear. I'm extrapolating from a pattern of underestimation. Every boundary we assume that they couldn't cross, they've approached. I'd rather overestimate and be wrong than underestimate and be dead. The night was the quietest we'd experienced. No generator, no wind, no sound from the water. Caleb slept on the common room table because moving him was too painful. Lena sat in a chair beside him, her head bowed, and I think she slept too. Though when I checked on them at midnight, her eyes opened immediately, alert and aware, as if sleep for her had become a shallow, provisional thing that could be revoked at any moment. I stood my watch on the dock with Marcus. The sky was clear, the stars absurd in their indifference. The water was black glass. And somewhere in that blackness, 11 miles east, things that had been people were standing in the surf, facing our direction, making a sound that mapped the distance between us with the precision of instruments they no longer knew they possessed. If they come, Marcus said very quietly, we can hold the dock for a while. Bottleneck, 2 axes, the flare gun, the fishing gaff. But we can't hold it forever. And if they come in numbers, real numbers, the barricade won't matter. So, what do we do? He was quiet for a long time. Then, we take the research boat, load everyone, head north, find another island, further out. There are hundreds in the archipelago, some uninhabited, some with seasonal cabins. We keep moving until the distance is enough, or until we find someone else who's still alive and has a better plan than we do. Leave the station. Leave everything, the food stores, the infrastructure, the lab, the shelter. Take what we can carry and go. He turned to me in the darkness. I know what it costs. This place has been your work, your life, for 2 years. But your life is worth more than your work, Elliot. And right now, I'm not sure this island is big enough to hide us anymore. I didn't answer. I looked at the water, and the water looked back with the blank patience of something that has never been in a hurry. 2 more days of silence. 2 more days of rationing, whispering, watching the water. Caleb's leg was infected. Not the other kind, the ordinary kind, bacterial, the wound reddening and swelling despite our cleaning regimen. Jinseo administered the last of the broad-spectrum antibiotics and told me privately that without proper medical treatment, he'd lose the leg within a week, maybe sooner. He knows, she said. He's doing the math on his own body now, calculating how much function he'll retain, how much mobility, what his caloric needs will be with reduced muscle mass. I asked him to stop. He said the numbers are the only thing keeping him sane. Lena came to me on the morning of day 18 with a decision already formed. I could see it in her posture, the slightly forward lean, the direct eye contact, the absence of hedging language. She'd weighed the variables and arrived at a conclusion, and she was about to ask me to accept it. Marcus is right, she said. We need to leave, not in a week, not when the food runs out. Tomorrow. What changed? I went to the eastern bluff this morning, early before dawn. I brought the binoculars. She paused. The figures in the water. There are more of them, significantly more. And they're closer, not at the mainland shore anymore. They're standing in the shallows, maybe 2 miles out. I could see them with the naked eye at first light. Just shapes, standing in the ocean, in water up to their waists or chests. Dozens, maybe more. My stomach turned over. 2 miles. The shelf is shallow there. They're walking the bottom, stopping where the depth forces them to stop. But the shelf extends further in some places, and the tide is a factor. At low tide, they can advance. At high tide, they retreat or hold position. They're moving with the tidal cycle, Elliot. That's not random. That's responsive. 2 miles. 9 miles of deep water still between us and them. But 2 miles of that 11 had already been crossed, and the mechanism was clear. They walked until the water was too deep, waited, and walked again when the conditions allowed. It was slow. It was relentless. It didn't require intelligence. It required only the thing that the infected seemed to have in unlimited supply: patience without awareness, persistence without purpose, the mechanical continuation of a directive that whatever remained of their brains could not override. We told the group at breakfast. Dana received the news with a stillness that had become her default state. Not frozen, not numb, but conserved. As though she'd learned to spend emotional energy only on the things she could act on. Marcus nodded, already thinking about load capacity and fuel range. Jin Seo started packing her observation notes, then stopped and looked at the stacks of paper and the laptop and the carefully assembled matrix of everything she'd learned. And I saw her make a calculation of her own. What to carry and what to leave behind, and whether the knowledge she'd gathered would matter if they didn't survive the crossing. Caleb was the problem. Moving him would be agonizing. The research boat had a cabin where he could lie flat, but every wave, every swell, every change in direction would transmit through the hull to his shattered leg. We had no painkillers left. The infection was spreading. He knew what he was facing, and he told me so in the blunt, numerical language that was the only dialect he trusted. My mobility is near zero. My caloric need is elevated due to infection response. My medical prognosis without treatment is systemic sepsis within 10 to 14 days. I am, by any rational assessment, a liability. You're a person, Caleb. I'm a variable. And you don't have the margin to carry variables that don't contribute to the group's survival probability. That's not how this works. That is exactly how this works. It's how it's always worked. You just haven't had to say it out loud before. I left the room because if I stayed, he'd convince me. And being convinced by that argument would cost me something I couldn't afford to lose. We spent the rest of the day preparing. Marcus assessed the research boat. Engine functional, fuel sufficient for maybe 60 miles, more if we supplemented from the second wind's tanks. We loaded supplies, remaining food, water, the first aid kit, the flare gun, the solar panel, Jin Seo's notes in a waterproof bag, tools, blankets, the VHF radio. Every item was weighed against space and necessity. We took the axes, we took the filleting knife. We took Caleb's legal pad because he asked for it, and because denying a man his only coping mechanism felt like a cruelty beyond what the situation already demanded. The plan was simple. Head north at first light, follow the archipelago, stay away from the mainland. Look for an island with fresh water, shelter, and enough distance from any populated area to rebuild the margins we'd lost. It was not a plan for rescue. It was not a plan for victory. It was a plan for continued existence, which was the only kind of plan that still made sense. That night, our last on the island, I walked through the station one final time. The lab where I'd spent 2 years cataloging kelp diversity, a life's work that now seemed as remote as a civilization on another planet. The common room where we'd gathered every evening, the whiteboard still showing Lena's categories. The bunk where I'd lain awake listening to rain and generator hum and the sounds of people breathing in adjacent rooms, alive and present and still themselves. I stopped at the whiteboard. Under assets, threats, and decisions, I wrote a fourth category. I wrote, what we carried. Below it, I listed 6 names. I turned off the candle and went to bed. We left at dawn. The engine caught on the second pull, and Marcus guided us out of the cove at quarter throttle, keeping the noise as low as the motor would allow. Caleb lay in the cabin on a pallet of blankets, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on some middle distance that existed only inside his own calculations. Lena sat in the bow. Dana was beside Marcus at the helm. Jin Seo was beside me, her waterproof bag pressed against her chest, watching the island shrink behind us. I looked back once. The station was small and gray against the tree line, already losing definition. The dock where we'd stood watch, the bluff where I'd first seen the second wind, the cove where Dana had found the hand that started everything. All of it folding into distance, becoming shape, becoming memory. Then I looked east, toward the mainland we were fleeing. And I saw them. The figures in the water, visible even from the boat, standing in the shallows 2 miles from our island's shore. Silent, still, facing outward. And as our engine sound crossed the water toward them, I saw the nearest ones begin to move, taking slow, deliberate steps deeper, following the sound, following us, continuing their patient, relentless traverse of the distance between what they had been and what they now were. I turned north and didn't look back again. The ocean was wide, the fuel was finite, and somewhere ahead, on an island we hadn't found yet, there was a chance that silence could still save us. If we could learn to live inside it long enough to forget that the world behind us had stopped being quiet a long time ago. My name is Elliot Voss. We are 6. We are moving. And the water between us and what follows is the only wall we have left.